entitled Parallels Between the Pandemic and Climate Change. My name is Steve Vavris. I'm a senior scientist in the Nelson Institute Center for Climatic Research, and I'll serve as your moderator today. As background, the impetus for this session was the recognition that the pandemic and climate change have been two of the most consequential recent crises, and yet the connections between them are not always obvious. So during the next 45 minutes, we'll discuss some of these connections and how they might inform and guide us moving forward. To do that, we've assembled a highly qualified group of panelists with expertise in one or both of these topics. My first introduction will be Beth Churchill. She is a community and social impact consultant with American Family Insurance. And her sidekick, Christopher Canto, who could not make it on the panel today, did appear in the video that you hopefully watched ahead of time. Our next panelist is Dylan Jennings. He is the Director of Public Information for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or GLFWC. And we also have Jonathan Patz, who is a professor in the Nelson Institute and Director of the Global Health Institute at UW-Madison. I'd also like to give a shout out to our graduate student, Gazong Yangji, who will be fielding your questions and then relaying them to me as the moderator to turn over to the panelists. And Kelly Rupp, who's a program manager in the Nelson Institute and is providing tech support for us. The format of this session will consist of two sets of questions posed to our panelists. The first 20 minutes of which will be moderated questions that I'll pose, followed by a 20-minute open Q&A from the audience. And we're assuming and hoping that you watched the pre-recorded videos put together by our panelists, but if you didn't, don't worry, you'll still be able to follow along. And please submit your questions for the panelists in the Q&A feature found along the bottom of your screen. And I understand that you can even upvote questions from others that you think are particularly relevant and worth sharing. And then I'll relay a selected set of those questions to the panel. And now, before I begin with my first question, I'd like to offer any time for initial comments from any of our panelists. Dylan, would you like to set the stage for us today?
Aninga kina uya nitsa bisha kint edition of class celebration dode mashkazibing and dunjaba. Quemon denwe magni dog up panego na and mi quena mungo gu gida kimanan gaigo ma king. I when you dash gaigo ish beming ish begijigum nimi guchu otaguzed a kina giguya gama gaigo kina benesiwa gaigo oasia gaigo gawenji bematazian. New Jaganashi Bungi. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Was asked just a little bit ago to acknowledge some of the lands that all of us reside upon or are on at this point in time, and that sometimes acknowledging everything that we try to acknowledge in English doesn't do it justice, and we can't often eloquently say what we need to say. And so in our language, I just acknowledge that we're very, very grateful, and we can never forget the land that we all reside upon, the land that we all call home. We forget that a lot of the ancestors that have walked on before us were of indigenous communities, and that we acknowledge that we thank everything that in creation that Gawenji Bimatazian, everything that gives us life, from the ones that fly to the ones that the four-leggeds to the ones that swim, to the plants, to everything that takes care of us and continues to sustain us and make our lives a little bit better. And so wanted to acknowledge that and acknowledge all the lands that we currently reside upon. So mi omenik manwewe tuyan miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for setting the stage for this afternoon. Very well put. And now we will turn things over to the set of questions that I will share with the panel. And panelists, feel free to take whoever feels the most eager to answer the question. It's almost like pretend you have a microphone and somebody grabs it and starts speaking. And all three of you are welcome, or if there's one question you'll defer to, that's fine too. So my first question concerns social inequities, which we've been hearing a lot about lately. The pandemic has exposed a slew of social inequities, and these parallel many ongoing concerns about environmental justice in the climate crisis. What lessons can we apply from the pandemic to create more equitable responses to climate change? Who would like to tackle that first one?
I have a lot of ideas, but I don't have to go first.
Well, you'll all have a chance to speak, so.
How about Beth?
I love it. Thank you for that, Jonathan, and thank you, Dylan, as well. Well, one of the things that we've been thinking about and talking about in advance of this is that obviously the pandemic has helped us connect the dots between climate change and the complexity of its reach and its impact. The pandemic did not slow the momentum of passionate people organizing around activism or advocacy. Instead, it became a catalyst, illuminating the disparities of the health, safety, and access facing Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Individuals from all backgrounds and communities across the country banded together and the world to protest racial injustice, health access injustice, climate justice, and incite real change. You know, whether they took the form in organizing protests in the streets, scheduling virtual meetings, or sharing publicly a personal lived experience, the advocacy and activism continues to be elevated, as does the awareness. And I also want to say, like the pandemic, every person had their own unique climate story, their own lived experience that has affected their quality of life. It brought to light our interrelationship with each other, yet not everyone has a platform nor the resources to share their insights with others. So giving a platform for the voices and the lived experiences helps promote that collective advocacy around climate action and then the disparities that are brought to light. And another thing I want to add before I hand it over is, in many cases, climate change is not of one's vocabulary. Climate literacy is often centered around a lived experience, just like the pandemic. In the United States, those who have grown up in the California fires and now suffer from asthma, those who live on the East Coast and have moved multiple times due to displacement from significant storms and flooding, those who have worked for generations in the coal mining industry have an economic story to tell, as well as a health and quality of life story to tell. So that literacy of climate literacy, I would challenge us to say it's not really the word climate, it's really the authentic voice of the person. And the narrative needs to change to the people first language versus the climate action language. That's something I learned recently through the Institute's work in economic empowerment. We need to be intentional about changing that language. That's the individual's lived experience and putting humanity at the center, which is certainly what the pandemic has done. And I will turn it over.
All right, thank you, Beth, for sharing those thoughts. Dylan, anything to add to that? What are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree that the pandemic has become, a form of catalyst, and in a way, has shown that our communities, especially our marginalized communities, are very tired of always being thought of last, right? And if anything, it's really forced a lot of people to continue pushing, your leadership and voicing, your opinions and your judgment through voting, right? To make positive environmental decisions that positively impact health. What we saw here in northern Wisconsin, and maybe this is true all around. I can't speak for other areas, but a lot of people that were economically advantaged or capable of uprooting, their homes in urban areas, metropolitan areas, transition to more of our rural areas, right? And so a lot of communities, even tribal communities in our area, saw an uptick or a transition of more people moving north or moving kind of away from these populous city areas, in a response to the pandemic. And we don't have to get into the all the finite issues with that. I know we struggled with in some communities maintaining basic things like healthcare capacity because of that, right? But I think that created this, created and exemplified this glaring problem, right? In how our communities, especially our communities that are rooted within our reservations and within our homelands, we're here, we're here to stay. A lot of our communities don't have that opportunity or luxury to uproot and to move like that, right? And so the pandemic really highlighted a lot of those kind of disproportionate realities that you hear about.
Mhm.
Furthermore, I know I mentioned this in the video too that we recorded. um, we all experienced food issues, right? So I mean, I'm not just talking toilet paper, right? Just there was supply issues all around, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, and even in the middle and different junctures of the pandemic. People panic bought, and that created hardship on some families, some communities that couldn't get some of the basic amenities. And so, to me, it really highlighted the need to not only reform some of our decision making processes, but also really take a strong look at how we're equipping ourselves on the food sovereignty realm, right? And making sure that our communities are all empowered, our communities, marginalized or not, all empowered to be able to respond and to grow your own food, and to be able to subsist if it came to it, where we didn't have that safety net of grocery stores and other forms of resources. And I would um, I'd probably say, I can't speak 100% for a lot of our urban areas, but the areas where you probably don't have as much access to green space or to places to grow gardens and to be able to grow your own foods are probably even more disproportionately affected by those types of things. And so I think pandemic has really kind of lifted a veil to a lot of those aspects. Thank you.
Thanks. And Dylan, your comment about the migration reminds me of some people's ability to move when there's a hurricane, like Hurricane Katrina, if they have the means, and not everyone does. And it's analogous. So I want to get Jonathan for the last word here on this first question.
Yeah, I think I'm basically going to just piggyback onto what Beth and Dylan said, and tie some of what they said together across the many inequities that COVID has uncovered. Thinking about the risk of dying from COVID, if you're Black, you have a 3.7 times the risk compared to being white. And if you're Indigenous, you're 3.5 times as likely of dying from COVID. And this gets back to what Beth talked about as far as access to healthcare. And one of the reasons that if you're Black or Indigenous individual, you may likely have pre-existing conditions that put you at higher risk. And it's a reflection on the unfairness of our healthcare system in the United States. So number one, right off the bat, that revealed an issue there. Another thing, the risk of dying from COVID is related to pollution. And a study out of Harvard showed that simply a small increase in fine particle pollution, PM 2.5, an increase of 1 microgram per cubic meter of air of PM 2.5 increased your risk of dying by 8%, controlling for all the other factors you need to control for. So if you live in a polluted area, that's not fair and you're at higher risk. If you don't have access to healthcare, it puts you into a higher risk category. So huge areas there. And then I'll just finally say, Dylan talked about marginalized groups. Right now, as we're rolling out the vaccine, there are many countries that have no access. And I remember Greta Thunberg recently said there should absolutely not be a physical meeting for the next conference of the parties on climate change, because anyone from a poor country is not vaccinated and can't go to the meeting. So it comes straight into the climate change story, yet again about the unfairness that this pandemic has revealed across many different ways of aspects of life, be it from our healthcare system to the air we breathe to the ability to get vaccinated. Inequities all over the place.
Yep, great points. Well, shifting gears a bit to a more positive note, the next question I have is about silver linings. So despite the profound heartache during the past year, the pandemic has also fostered a number of silver linings that have helped us cope with this public health emergency. What silver linings from the COVID experience are transferable to help us cope with the climate crisis? Who's feeling optimistic and wants to tackle that one first? I know, Dylan, you talked quite a bit about that in your presentation. Would you like to kick things off on that one?
Sure. I try to be a positive person about a lot of things, right? Pandemic has really caused a lot of stress all across the country, all across the world. I don't need to reiterate that, right? That it's been difficult for a lot of people, simply because we've been kind of uprooted from the norm, that the social norm that we're, used to, and kind of forced or compelled to live somewhat differently, right? And change can be difficult for anybody, but a lot of times our stories, our traditional ways of thinking, and our knowledge systems either predict these kinds of things, or they perpetuate teachings that we're supposed to keep in mind during any kind of situation or what we might perceive as disaster. Um, and so one thing that I thought about a lot, in a lot of our indigenous leadership, our knowledge holders, some of our elders reiterated that, um, throughout this, it really was meant to be a time of reflection, right? A time to slow down. Or even if, a lot of us living these really fast lives, right? And going from meeting to meeting, um, constantly trying to, push things forward, kind of move that proverbial boulder forward for our generation, it's different, right? It's a juxtaposition, because we're often taught that in order to get things done, we have to be on the move, right? And really, to me, was sitting back and reflecting that, you know, reflecting on life, reflecting on what lessons and things were coming out of this pandemic. To me, it was a reminder how powerful Mother Earth is, right? In our language, Gita Kimana no Ma King, the way that we describe the earth is animate, right? So we put animacy within, it's embedded within our language, because we know, these places to be alive, right? And number two, was the notion that sometimes that fast paced and the busy lifestyles that we lead are probably not the best for the environment, right? From reading all the reports about how carbon emissions are reduced just from people staying home, right, was a reminder to me, like, wow, I would, as much as I love to go eat down in Madison, right, I'm kind of glad I don't have to travel down there right now and gas my vehicle up and head all the way down there and join a bunch of people. It's nice to be able to connect somehow, but still not spread that impact. Um, Another thing, like I said earlier, we saw a lot of community members and just a lot of people in general, people that I've never seen garden before, starting gardens, take control of that food narrative, right? I think that's been huge, and we saw a lot of people rekindling that relationship within our communities, with our traditional practices, from harvesting maple syrup, or maple sap to make syrup and sugar, right, to harvesting fish and taking care of those ones, to hunting, to gardening, to trying new things, right, and spending more time, in their little home areas, taking care of their families. And so, to me, there was a lot to have been learned by, to be learned by experiencing this, and it's something that I'll always take moving forward and think about, as I might, as I endure other experiences or leadership capacity, to remember that, right, that um things just in our way of life, things just don't happen without reason. So definitely some things that I continue to think about, and sure there'll be more things that come up as time goes on that remind me or kind of compel me to think more about reflecting on what happened.
Yeah, good point. I know a lot of people have appreciated the slower pace and having more time because of other things they don't have to do, like a long commute. Jonathan, your thoughts?
Yeah, like immediately less air travel for scientific meetings and speaking a lot on. I spoke this morning for Earth Day at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and I didn't even have to get on a plane. So some immediate benefits there. I think for me, the most striking um, silver lining occurred with an image in a newspaper that I bet you most all of you saw, which was a before and after picture from New Delhi, India, when we had, we shuttered the global economy because of COVID and fossil fuels were not burned. And for the first time in, I don't know how many decades, people in New Delhi could see the Himalayan mountains. And you saw this amazing image. Every year, a new analysis shows that almost 9 million people die prematurely from air pollution, specifically from air pollution from burning fossil fuels. And we know that pollution kills people, but to have this stark, difference of before, after, shut down the fossil fuel economy. And, there have been studies that show that more than 24,000 lives were saved in China over 2 months simply from less air pollution. And there are other studies around the world that are popping up showing that, well, if we can get to clean energy, we would be saving a lot of lives. So I think that that's, for me, the biggest silver lining, this stark reality that air pollution is terrible around many parts of the world. Even in the United States, we have tens of thousands of people that die from air pollution. And the silver lining is that the UN secretary and the Biden administration are all calling to build back better, to not get back to normal and certainly not to go back to the dirty fossil fuels that we were on, but to go to a clean energy economy where everyone prospers. And here's the golden opportunity to get back to doing that right. And I'll end by just saying optimistically, it's so feasible with solar energy being so cheap, and that, we don't have to wait for it. We just need the political will. So I think it's been a great lesson, and hopefully we will build back better. And the climate summit today and tomorrow that's happening in the Biden administration, hopefully we'll see some results from that.
Thanks. It makes you wish CO2 were a visible gas instead of invisible. Then we'd be able to see that pollutant.
Yeah.
And Beth, how would you like to round this out for that question?
Oh, thank you, Steve. I'll just really just compliment what Dylan shared and Jonathan added to, but I really just have been so inspired by the connection to the natural world that is occurring. Individuals who may not have ever thought about that connection, who are accessing it even in their most tightest urban environment because they needed to be out and wanted to be out in something, or growing their own food in their windowsill or in where they currently are. And I just have seen that firsthand in so many ways. I went on, every time I went to hike, I saw entire families in every type of gear and shoes and footwear, just exploring. And I just see the connection to nature, that relationship with the natural world. If that is something that grows out of this, there is so much to inform the health of our future planet if that connection to the natural world has been enhanced due to the pandemic.
Yeah, and those are great examples because they all directly relate to climate change and burning fewer fossil fuels and so on. So very good examples. And so now I want to turn things over to the audience Q&A. We have one question so far. I've got a couple in my back pocket if things slow down, but we do have one question that's come in already that I'll pose to the panelists. And that is about the business community. So the point is, businesses don't need to wait for elected officials to lead on climate change. Is there a role for the business community to coordinate among itself and provide leadership that may be lacking in the state or elsewhere?
I can take that one.
Since you're
Can
in the
we
business
start it
world.
off? Absolutely. And as those on the call know and the panel know that my colleague on the video and I represent American Family Insurance, whose business is in risk and resiliency, and the work that business has been doing to be a partner in progress is pretty relevant and pretty the commitment is high, the commitment is there. You can't turn a page, you can't look anywhere without seeing another major commitment by an organization. And I'll just speak to us. We have, over the last 10 years, been in this space of planning and implementing and partnering and growing. And we, in the very recent near term, the actual, as we know, the financial industry, and that is where the insurance industry lives, all the way from Wall Street to Main Street, is speaking to the real expectations of being that partner in progress and being an activist in climate action and community resiliency. We have quite a portfolio of history in that space, which hopefully many have heard about or seen. And we absolutely know that extreme weather is increasing severity and frequency. We absolutely are partnering with the UW and the insurance commissioners and the industry experts and nonprofits and organizations to help develop methods to assess, to mitigate, to adapt. Lots to talk about there. And the other thing is that we, like many businesses, are publicly committing. We publicly committed to 2030, net zero last year. And we actually have a strategy to get there. It isn't just a talk. The American Family doesn't know how to talk unless it's been walking. It's in our DNA. And so many businesses all around the world are leading in this space and committing immense amount of resources and internally and externally towards that.
Thanks. The insurance industry is all about managing disasters and crises, right? So you have a lot of experience with this. Jonathan or Dylan, what do you think in terms of the business community, what they can do to play a leadership role?
You know, I can reflect on another session just 2 days ago that I was on green hospitals, and it's and Jeff Thompson, who used to be the CEO of Gunderson Health, is known nationally and internationally for taking his healthcare system and trying for net carbon, to be carbon neutral by taking the La Crosse's the methane gas from the city dump and going through all sorts of conservation measures to save money for his hospital. I mean, he did it for environmental reasons, but then it turned out that they saved millions of dollars, and they said, well, even if we didn't care about climate change, and even if we didn't care about being socially and environmentally responsible, this saves money. Let's do it. So this meeting was of CEOs around Wisconsin, hospital CEOs. And so they're taking this seriously and realizing, there is a responsibility, but there's a business opportunity. And now with the incredibly dropping prices of renewable energy, and for the first time in history, the cheapest way to generate electricity is from renewables and batteries. This is according to the International Agency, the International Renewable Energy Agency, that it's sort of, we don't need to, you're wasting money if you're using fossil fuels. And we do need to get rid of, the government does have a role in getting rid of the perverse subsidies and get rid of those fuel subsidies and create a level playing field. But I think the businesses are seeing the writing on the wall. They're moving forward towards a low carbon footprint because that's the rest of the world is going that way, and the fuel prices are going that way as well.
Points. Dylan?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with what Beth and John were talking about as well. I think especially coming at things, if you want to help, coming at things with a lens of equity, right, and understanding that was a big part of the governor's task force on climate change work, right? Everything that we touched and looked at had to have that lens and understanding that every decision that we make could have adverse impacts for some of our marginalized communities or other communities around the area. And so decisions, in the business realm should, in my mind, always be made with that lens. True consultation and true community, true community work, would look like, just that, involving your local communities and stakeholders from your community to identify, ways that you can help, right? So, keeping those marginalized communities in mind to help build capacity within your community, and to gain access to healthy resources and services, so that we're uplifting all of our demographics, right? And so that those kinds of moves are made in that kind of way. Also, everything from the choices that our businesses make, from choosing to support sustainable practices and whatnot. Those are also important thing as well. And also, working with our local communities and creating both adaptation and mitigation strategies, right? And that could be on the kind of small surface level, or it could be thinking big, broader community region wide. But our businesses can have huge impact, and I very much look at a lot of our businesses as leaders in within our respective areas, within our respective economies. And so and I think those are all definitely things to think about. And I always got to give a plug to a lot of our tribal communities. If you have the ability, as a business, support our indigenous communities too. Our artists, our indigenous food producers, all of those. It's very important.
Thanks. And I want to have time for at least a couple more questions from the audience. That we're coming up on about 12 minutes left. The next question I'm going to relay to you comes from one of the attendees, and it's basically saying, it's talking about denialism regarding the pandemic. We heard some of that in the past year. We've also heard some of that regarding climate change. So what similarities or differences do you see between the receptions of these two public issues, public acceptance or denial about the pandemic, and paralleling that with climate change?
I mean, I see a lot of parallels. I think it's a great question. And I'm going to channel a doctor who's actually the chair of the Wisconsin Health Professionals for Climate Action, Joel Charles. He asked this question about COVID-19. If you knew that this pandemic was coming, if you knew 5 years in advance that this pandemic was going to happen, how would you respond? What would you do differently? And so in some ways, it's the exact same. We know that climate change is real. We know it has bad impacts. And we know that based on the last assessment, we have 9 years to cut our emissions in half, or it's really going to get bad. So we know that. And so we're not acting. There are we're not acting fast enough. So there's, and when the pandemic unfolded, we mobilized too late. And there, even to today, there's still denial. Political, there's a lot of denial out there. So in some way, it's a great observation that what we're seeing with COVID in some ways is parallel to climate change. COVID is like a climate change disaster, a high speed, version of it. And I think that there's a lot to learn there, and we do need to do a better job of communication. And it's not communication and education; it's a lot more than that. It's trying to understand where people are coming from and find common denominators, find common ground. It's why I push for climate change. It's why I push the health narrative, because I think there's a lot more common ground to bring on, moderates that can be convinced around a health issue compared to more of an environmental issue, even though it's both. But I think they're very similar, COVID and climate change.
Thanks, Jonathan, because that touches on a follow-up question somebody just posted, and that is, how do we reach people who deny the seriousness of climate change or the seriousness of the pandemic? So you basically answered that, and I'll use that as another option for how you all can handle that question too, Beth and Dylan. But feel free to answer it however you'd like.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that concept that applies to all aspects of one's own values and one's informed path and lived experiences. That's why I was thinking the narrative needs to change around, it's the people first language and not the action first language. And that's really a term I'm just now kind of, a term meaning a vocabulary, a vernacular I'm trying to immerse myself in through the other work that we do, that I'm have the honor of being a part of. And that means that each individual lived experience is where it starts. And the word climate change is a literacy challenge, meaning it may not mean that to an individual. It may mean, I've been taking care of my mother because, or it may mean, like, as Dylan was saying, I wanted to leave, but we can't. And so this is who we are. And so I think it has something to be said about changing the narrative. And of course, that's all in the center of, equity and inclusivity. So meeting an individual where they're at, as Jonathan said.
Yep. And Dylan, anything to add with that?
Yeah, I think that I really agree with what John and Beth are saying as well. I think in general, oftentimes, when people don't live in some of these areas that are adversely and heavily impacted by climate change, or they don't understand their food systems. If you're an individual, and I don't mean this by any offense, but if you're an individual that thinks that their food comes from a grocery store, right? Or you can't see yourself, right? And I mean see yourself as in see and begin to understand and conceptualize your own impacts, right? You're missing a major component to understanding climate change in totality, right? And so I always encourage people to, recenter themselves, right? Begin thinking long term. There's nothing wrong with thinking long term, right? It's just oftentimes, people are not as concerned with the short term because we're here, we're living now, things are fine. But most people have children. Most people want to have children, have grandchildren someday, or have relatives that will live on, into future generations. And so, you always have to think about, and I think about some of my elders here have said, right? We always have to be thinking about that seventh generation to come, right? 7 generations from now, it's our inherent duty and job to be thinking about those generations before they even get here, because inherently somebody was thinking about us prior to us being here. And so, we have to share that same sentiment moving forward. I also am a big proponent of trying to reach people in a gentle manner and not to fight. And I know it can be extremely hard, and I don't mean to say this disrespectfully, but some people say some really stupid things, that just like, I can't believe that person just said that. And I'm sure each and every one of you have had that experience. You don't have to lie. And, we don't have to engage with that, right? We don't have to fight that. That's not our responsibility. That's something internally that person has to work through. And so we'll wear ourselves out if we think we're going to try and convince everybody that this is an issue that everybody needs to pull weight with. We need to focus on taking good care of ourselves, taking good care of our families, helping one another that are interested in moving these initiatives forward. And I think that's where we're gonna see the biggest form of social change. And furthermore, I said earlier, we need to focus heavily on our environment, getting our children exposed and out into our environment, and getting our children to know and understand their food systems, right? Because I heard a tribal leader say this a long time ago. They met with some kids, some youth there in their community, and asked, where do tomatoes come from? And the kid raised his hand and said, from a can. And then and there, and I know this probably happens everywhere, that's when we know we have problems, and we need to do a better job of educating about our system so that people know and understand that, and empower them to do something about some of that stuff. So just things that I think about off the top of my head. I know it's a lot of work, and like I said, you'll wear yourself out if you try to, if you attempt to convince every single person that you encounter and run into that's, dead set against the notion of climate change. It's not going to happen. So pace yourself. It's a marathon.
Thanks, Dylan.
You
We
know,
have less
Steve-
than 5 minutes left, and I want to get one more question in. So please keep your responses brief, because we do need to cut off at 5. But it's about risk perception, and we've all been juggling lots of risks simultaneously during the pandemic: health, financial, social, and so on. Do you think these experiences of managing pandemic risks will carry over and affect how people perceive risks associated with climate change?
Well, Steve, that's one of my slides, my transition slides in my lecture, which is that after all the hardship with COVID that people have had to do prior to the vaccine, and the lockdown and the economic hardships, will people be able to bear yet another global emergency crisis? And my answer is climate change, unlike COVID, is a golden opportunity when you look across the 3 sectors: energy, food systems, and transportation, that to get to a low carbon economy across those 3 will save almost 25 million lives every year. So, a clean energy, sustainable food and transportation society is super healthful, health promoting. So and then, sort of generically, I think, 30 to 40%, it's real, it's serious, you got to respect it for the emergency it is. And yet 60 to 40% of my message is there's a lot of hope, and it's a golden opportunity. And I'll just say one last thing because I think we only half answered Kermit's question, which is that it's absolutely going to take a full court press. It can't just be people going to LED light bulbs and riding a bike. It's got to be full-fledged at the administrative level, get rid of the subsidies, put an equitable price on carbon, and do lots of conservation. It's got to be a million different things. It won't be just either individual level or corporate level or government. It's got to be all of them.
Yep,
So I'll
all of
stop.
the above. Thanks. And Beth, quickly, any comments on that one?
Yeah, that's great. And I'm glad you circled back with Kermit there. And also I would say that if for those that did get to see the Just Responses session midday, certainly worth recognizing, incredible leadership with Rihanna and Kyle on the policy side of equity and inclusion and access to the change we all want to see, and building it better without back, breaking down the systemic systems and rebuilding them in all shapes and forms. So it's all of that in that. And we always say, when there's risk, there's opportunity. So the word risk could have a value to it, or a concern, or a whole bunch of scenarios to it, as does the other side of that, the opportunities around that. There is a massive, as you can see with the work of the administration right now, a massive opportunity for growth and jobs and engagement and re-engagement in our society, and all those systems: transportation, healthcare, food, etc., renewable energy.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to sound just like an anchor person and say, Dylan, we only have about 30 seconds. Any final quick comments that you'd like to add before we close?
Yeah, I'll just, just be real brief. I think a risk and opportunities, I ultimately just think oftentimes this whole issue could be solved with a little bit more tolerance, right? So we need to take a risk to be more tolerant of everybody within our communities, right? In our language, we have a really good way of talking about, or just one word saying "joanna dig," and that literally means take care of each other. And so, taking care of each other might sound like a risk, but the opportunities to do so, and the opportunities that stem from when you think proactively about your communities and truly take care of them, there's that limitless opportunities. So, miigwech.
Thank you, Dylan. It's a perfect way to end on a high note. We're coming up on 5 o'clock now, so I want to thank all of you for attending, and I want to thank especially the panelists for taking the time and producing those videos and sharing their expertise. So a remote thank you from wherever you are, and I know we're all in different places right now, another silver lining of the pandemic, I guess. So I will end it. I don't know if Kelly, if you're going to be the one officially closing the webinar, but we are up to 5 o'clock, and I know some of you want to attend other sessions. So I think we will close out, and have a great rest of your Earth Day. Enjoy the remaining sunshine, a couple hours left of sunshine. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Steve.